all of you have been through the exhibit on your way here, those of you who have not had the good fortune to see it before. And I'm thrilled to welcome you here to the United Nations. I'm Ramu Damodran. I'm working on the United Nations Academic Impact, which is a program initiated by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, which will be exactly 1 year old tomorrow. And we're thrilled to be able to commemorate the eve of our anniversary with this discussion. We have a young French radical working in our office, Nathalie Leroy, who came up with the idea of the theme of this discussion, the right to the city, which actually owes the phrase to a French writer, André Lefebvre. And talking about this concept of the right of a city, he said, one could even assert that the maximum of utopianism could invite the optimum of realism. Now, that's a very philosophical and, I dare say, a very French way of putting something fairly simple, but that's really what the United Nations Academic Impact is trying to do, to reconcile what is utopian and possibly thought of as unrealizable with something that is hard-headed and realist, and really what the United Nations is all about. So bringing these two communities together, the UN in which we all are, and the academic institutions that all of you represent. I would, in that context, particularly like to welcome this evening students who've joined us from the City University of New York, Fairfield University, Felician College, Fordham University, Rutgers University, New York University, St. John's University, Monmouth University, and, of course, the high school students of East Stroudsburg South High School in Pennsylvania, who are members of the United Nations Academic Impact Aspire group. I think Michelle Vera is here with them. Michelle, could you just quickly tell us about the group that you brought from Aspire? If you just press the mic and just tell us. Oh, okay, then you can take over. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much. And also a very warm welcome to the members of the Cooper-Hewitt Museum, who always have a standing invitation to these events, and many of whom have taken the trouble to join us this evening. We have two parts of our program this evening. We have the introductory part with Michael Adlerstein and Cynthia Smith, and then we go on to a panel discussion. One of the remarkable coincidences, if you will, about this exhibition is that it frames the day on which the 7 billionth baby was born in the world, making us, in the phrase of our Secretary General, 7 billion strong. And there was this perception, I think, which you will see in the exhibit, that of the 7 billion people in the world today, as many as 1 billion live in slums. And by UN projections, that number will double in the next 18 years by the year 2030. And so it is very heartening when you're confronted with that grim statistic to hear what Cynthia Smith had to say when she said that some could see that statistic of 1 billion people as a problem, or you can see it as a potential to engage with the attitude of the designers who are in this exhibition, and who can come up with socially sustainable, scalable solutions to the problems that these 7 billion face. And with that word of framing what the exhibit is all about and what Cynthia has so eloquently done, both in this exhibit, incidentally, is the more democratic version of the earlier exhibit. The earlier exhibit was called Design for the Other 90%. This is Cities with the Other 90%. So Cynthia, would you like to introduce the exhibit and launch our discussion?
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. Cooper-Hewitt is very pleased to partner with UN Academic Impact Initiative and UN Habitat in presenting Design with the Other 90% Cities exhibition here at the United Nations. We're also pleased to be a member of UN Academic Impact's initiative, and this has provided us a very unique opportunity to bring this work to a broader international community. If you don't know us, Cooper-Hewitt is the National Design Museum. We're part of the U.S.'s National Museum System, the Smithsonian Institution. Cooper-Hewitt is one of 2 Smithsonian museums in New York City. Most of the rest of them are located in Washington, D.C. And while Cooper-Hewitt is on the move, as we expand our galleries in the museum, we are here at the United Nations this coming May. We will be out on Governor's Island with graphic design now in production exhibition, and then we continue our stellar lecture series around the city. On December 1st, the next exhibition program that explores design solutions highlighted in Design with the Other 90% Cities will also be held here at the United Nations, where we'll bring together stakeholders from Bangkok, Thailand's successful Bang Bua Canal Community Upgrade Project. And on December 15th, we're very pleased to also partner with the United Nations, celebrating Oscar Niemeyer. It's a lecture on one of the United Nations' initial architects, and again, that will take place here at the United Nations. In addition to that, our museum's director, Bill Mogridge, continues his Build Design talks around the city, and he'll be down in Tribeca at WNYC's Green Space. And finally, Design Revolutions is a historic design lecture series that spans the Renaissance to contemporary design, which takes place at the University Club. To register for any of these, including the United Nations panels, the next two that are coming up, you can find out more about the lectures. Please go to cooper-hewitt.org. Now, I wanted to find out how many people in the auditorium tonight have already seen the exhibition. Could I have a raise of hands? Wow, that's pretty impressive. I would say that's about 85 to 90% of the people in the room tonight. Those of you who haven't seen it, it is located right across the way. If you turn to the right as you're going through security. It's open daily and is free to the general public until January 9th, 2012. We do plan to take it on the road, so look for more information about that. Design with the Other 90% Cities is part of, is the second in an exhibition series. As Ramu pointed out, the first one was Design for the Other 90%, which opened in 2007. This particular exhibition examines how design can address very complex issues arising from the unprecedented rate of urban growth projected to take place over the next 20 years. Close to 1 billion people now live in informal settlements, more commonly known as slums, favelas, or squatter settlements. That number is projected to swell to 2 billion by the year 2030. And within that, in an increasingly climate-challenged world. Design with the Other 90% Cities was conceived to broaden an exchange of knowledge among people living in our growing cities, architects and designers, NGOs, and policymakers. There are a number of ways that you can explore the issues and solutions within the city's exhibition that extend beyond the exhibition itself. You can visit the exhibition's website at designother90.org. You can join the design, and I think this is important for the students in the room and the design professionals and others in the room. You can join the Design Other 90 Network, which just launched this month, to share your own work. And you can also follow us on Twitter at Design Other 90. This evening, if any of you in the audience are tweeting, please use the hashtag Other 90 Cities so we can reference your conversation. The exhibition itself includes 60 projects and proposals from 25 countries from around the world. And I'm pleased to say we have 2 designers whose initiatives were included in the exhibition. That includes Sao Paulo's urban mining and Nairobi's Kibera Space Project. I'm looking forward to their comments. These 2 innovative solutions for creating more inclusive and sustainable communities. And as the world's population expands and resources diminish, we need our cities to be more sustainable and resilient for every resident, for every citizen. This is the leading challenge for this century. I'm looking forward to hearing a rigorous discussion tonight about these very issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Cynthia. And thank you for that reference to Oscar Niemeyer, who, God bless him, will be 104 years old on December the 15th. And Oscar Niemeyer, to whom we owe much of the architecture, the physical architecture of the United Nations, had once said that he creates with courage and idealism, but also with an awareness of the fact that what is important in life, friends, and attempting to make this unjust world a better place in which to live. And I think that's a thought that imbues all these 60 projects that Cynthia referred to. Oscar Niemeyer also once said that architecture essentially is all about surprise. And that leads me to our next speaker, because when you come back to these premises, I would say in about 14 months from now, you will be surprised. And the cause for that surprise will be Michael Adlerstein, who is the Executive Director of the United Nations Capital Master Plan, Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, someone who's been intimately involved with enjoying the space that we know as New York City today, working with the New York Botanical Gardens, working with Ellis Island, and I must add, I'm from India, and I know we have a number of friends from Pakistan who've come to us from East Stroudsburg High School. You've done a lot, Michael, for a common heritage of ours, the Taj Mahal, for which we're grateful. Michael?
Thank you. Welcome to the United Nations, and I would also like to add that Oscar Niemeyer, just before his birthday, also got remarried, so he's still very young at heart. I'm very pleased to have been invited to speak with you tonight about sustainable design and the ongoing project to renovate the United Nations headquarters in a sustainable manner. I'd like to express my appreciation to Cooper-Hewitt and for the excellent exhibit that so many of you have seen in the General Assembly lobby, and to Ramu Damodaran for organizing tonight's program. In the early 1940s, the 6-block stretch of the East River waterfront between 42nd and 48th Street was an industrial zone, hosting slaughterhouses, truck traffic, barges, oil tanks, and smokestacks. And this was not the role model for a sustainable city yet. Through a series of fortuitous events, within 10 years, the very same 6-block area had been transformed to a beautiful campus of modernist buildings designed by some of the world's most prominent architects, which included Oscar Niemeyer and Le Corbusier and an incredible team, and incorporated the technology and design elements that were years ahead of their time. In many ways, the planning of the UN is one of the most successful design collaborations of the 20th century. I'd like to share with you the status of our efforts to protect and extend the life of this design legacy. The construction of the UN transformed forever not only the east side of Manhattan, but the classic view of, which is the classic view of Manhattan from Queens, but also of New York City itself as the international city and the headquarters of this world body. At the time it was built, the 17-acre complex was considered to be highly innovative, employing the best of new technologies. The modernist planning idea of organizing discrete but interconnected buildings in a poetic manner, and the open spaces between the UN's chambers were ideas ahead of their time. The very high-tech glass curtain wall was one of the first of its kind of that scale, later followed by thousands of buildings. The use of river water to naturally cool the chiller plant was also ahead of its time. But after 60 years of hard use, our facility had aged and was in need of more than a facelift. The mission of the Capital Master Plan is to manage the renovation of the headquarters to create a modern, safe, and sustainable work environment for the UN staff and visitors and our diplomats. Our project provides us with a once-in-a-generation opportunity to adopt safe and efficient technologies to reduce our power usage, our water consumption, and our carbon footprint. There are other important drivers for the project. One is to improve the functionality of a facility designed for 50 member states in a family that has grown to 193 members. And another driver, of course, is to enhance our safety and security in a much more dangerous world. The UN was completed in 1951 in accordance with the New York City Fire Code. Of that time, much has changed, but prior to our project, the UN had not. Consequently, the complex lacked basic safety systems like sprinklers, fire and smoke detectors, and of course all that will change with the Capital Master Plan. Another primary concern was overall security. Unfortunately, the UN has in recent years been the target of several attacks in Baghdad, Algiers, Kabul, and elsewhere, and the headquarters was beautifully designed for the concerns of the previous century. Our project will result in significant improvements to the security infrastructure of the UN, providing greater protection to the UN staff and delegates. The Capital Master Plan is broken into several phases, the first of which we completed in 2010, which was the relocation of the entire staff to swing space. We moved a few hundred staff each weekend throughout Midtown and Queens. The conferencing functions of the UN and the Office of the Secretary General were required by U.S. security to stay within the compound, so we constructed this building that we're sitting in now as a temporary home for the conference function. Significant construction work is underway presently, and the infrastructure of the basements of the complex, while interior fit-out is underway in the Secretariat and the conference building. We're on schedule and we're on budget to begin moving staff back into the renovated Secretariat building next summer and into the conference building for the rooms such as this by next winter. When the conference building renovation is completed, the renovation of the General Assembly Hall will start, and this building will host the General Assembly function for 18 months. We measure our performance with a variety of different performance metrics. Most importantly, we will reduce the total energy consumption of the UN headquarters by 50% as compared to existing conditions. We will reduce our carbon footprint by over 45%, and we'll reduce our consumption of fresh water by about 40%. The project provides the opportunity to improve the operational performance of the organization, and we raise our thermostats in the summer by 5 degrees to 78, saving energy on cooling, and in the winter we lower the thermostats by 5 degrees to 67, saving energy in the winter also. All these steps improve our sustainability, consistent with the initiatives of the Secretary General. Due to the international character of the United Nations, the project will not be certified through the U.S. Green Building Council or any other system. However, the project has been designed to meet the criteria of LEED's Gold and will achieve similar high ratings in the BREEAM system of the United Kingdom, the CASB system of Japan, and the Green Star system of Australia. These are all commendable, competitive, and important programs, and I strongly support their basic concept of sustainable design, rewarding sustainable new construction. However, I must note that none of these programs provide, in my view, proper credit and encouragement for the single most important decision that a building owner faces when faced with a major renovation like the Capital Master Plan: to recycle the building and tear it down, to recycle the building or to tear it down and build anew. The evidence of climate change is clearer each passing year, and each year throughout the world, people seek guidance to focus their efforts and take some action that will affect positive change. As we all know, the design and building industry is a major contributor to the carbon problem, and the industry has taken steps to reduce the impacts of new construction, but far more must be done. And to make our cities more sustainable, reducing the impact of new construction is one of the most important steps that we in our industry can take. But the various existing evaluation systems do not provide adequate recognition or weight for those projects like the Capital Master Plan, which opt to recapture the enormous energy of the initial construction effort, the embodied energy of the initial construction, and avoid the additional energy of demolition and new construction. The embodied energy of a material accounts for the energy used to extract, fabricate, deliver, install, demolish, and dispose of that particular material. For the building industry, to encourage the recycling of existing buildings as a plausible option there must be a better reward system for avoiding the waste of carbon. Without a bigger carrot, we will not slow down the cycle of demolition and new construction, and the extent of the world's new construction is problematic for those of us concerned with climate change. I refer to the recycling of not just the historic, iconic 1% of existing buildings, which are the low-hanging fruit, but the thousands of less glamorous but equally carbon-costly shopping centers, apartment buildings, office and/or industrial complexes scattered throughout the urban and suburban landscapes of the world. I'm often asked by member states if it would have been less expensive to completely demolish and rebuild the UN. And it's a reasonable question, and the answer is no. Even aside from the obvious loss of historic and iconic cultural value, it would not have been less expensive. And from an overall energy and environmental standpoint, it would have been a significant waste of carbon. Our most significant achievement in reducing our carbon footprint and supporting the Secretary General is the avoidance of the expenditure of the embodied energy incorporated into our headquarters. Of course, I do not propose the end of new construction, but we need to be stronger advocates for saving energy, for deeper consideration of recycling of older buildings before considering new construction. The renovation of the UN demonstrates that even with this iconic complex of historic buildings with conflicting budgetary, programmatic, and security demands, a highly sustainable renovation can be executed while fully respecting the character-defining features of the building. The Capital Master Plan is renovating the UN with the primary objective of providing a safer and more efficient meeting and workplace, but the emphasis of the Secretary General on environmental stewardship is our motivation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Michael. Those of you who read the New York Times review of the design exhibit by Michael Kimmelman would recall he had spoken of the exhibit as having big success stories that affirm the power of simple ideas. And I think Michael Adlerstein has brought that home to us, because what is happening here, the Capital Master Plan, promises to be a big success story, but the ideas underlining it are essentially very simple: efficiency, economy, usability, and I was very glad to hear you say, Michael, also factors of culture, of poetry, and of the iconic nature of the structure itself. Now, before we move on to the panel, if there are any questions or comments for Ms. Adlerstein or Ms. Smith, I would like to invite anyone who has them. Anyone at all? Oh, please. Is there a website?
Yes. Yes, so the Capital Master Plan on the UN websites, if you look very quickly, they are on this. It's cmp/un.org.
Yeah, Shannon, please.
Just curious, Mr. Adlerstein, are you in favor of the United Nations building a new, very environmental-friendly building on the Robert Moses site, our park, which now has been approved by our state, and hopefully the UN can purchase the land so we can have a wonderful esplanade in this old East Side River? What do you think of that?
Well, we are, the UN Development Corporation, the City of New York, the State of New York have passed legislation authorizing and permitting the building. We haven't started our discussions with New York City. Our discussions needed to follow the approval of the legislation. We are entering those discussions, so we're all enthusiastic that something positive will come out of it, but it will be up to the vote of the General Assembly. Well, issues like that are taken by the Secretariat and discussed and then brought to the General Assembly for a vote.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Right, then thank you very much, sir. Thank you, Cynthia. And I'll invite the panelists to come up. Thank you so much. Thank you. Sir? It's me. Yeah. And habitat here. Habitat. We now move on to the panel discussion, and we have with us this evening 5 very distinguished panelists who will cover a spectrum of perspectives in this discussion. We have Cecilia Martinez, who is the director of the Habitat Office at the United Nations in New York. Habitat, as most of you will know, is the UN Commission on Human Settlements, which is based in Nairobi in Kenya, and Ms. Martinez is head of the office here. We have Professor Michael Cohen of the New School of Social Research, which is a member of the United Nations Academic Impact. We have Ms. Shelina Odbert, who is an architect at the Kounkey Design Initiative, a non-profit which was founded 6 years ago, is that right? To design and build physically, economically, and socially sustainable public spaces at the Kibera Public Space Project in Kenya. We have Vanessa Padilla de Souza from the Secretariat for Housing of the Municipality of Sao Paulo in Brazil. And we have Eden Mahmoud, who is the director of the Black Sea University Network, a major organizational partner of the United Nations Academic Impact, who is actually in New York this week leading a team of 12 academicians from 7 countries, right, Eden, in the Black Sea region, discussing specific projects for the economic and environmental development of the Black Sea region with counterparts in the United Nations system. So Eden has been here since Monday, and we've been fortunate to have a number of meetings with him and his team. I'll begin by inviting Cecilia Martinez, who, as I said, is, like me, an international civil servant, but unlike me, has academic credentials, so is actually so pleased.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ramu, and good evening, everyone. And welcome again to the UN. I know I have 7 minutes, so it's almost Twitter time. But I would try to start by setting a little bit of the background. Why are we discussing this idea of sustainable and inclusive cities that everybody's talking about in a way, and we all talk about sustainability, and sometimes we don't know what we're talking about, I have to say. And I'll start, in fact, by most of the audience today is very young, and giving you a little bit of the history of why UN decided to have an agency like UN Habitat, in a way. And we started 33 years ago. Michael and I were very young, and we were already addressing issues of housing. And everybody was very concerned about shelter, because shelter is one of the human rights and one of the needs of humanity. So it all really started as a mandate of saying, how can we improve the conditions of housing in the world? And little by little, we have been moving all these 33 years, and we realized that housing, although it's so important, shelter is a basic need, no doubt. We are more and more concerned about not only the conditions of that shelter, but what that shelter is. Where is it located? And how are the conditions that surround the shelter? which means how do we work more and more with towns and with cities. And I will not repeat the figures that were put today by Ramu in terms of the 7 billion, but we are very concerned that from those 7 billion, as you well know, right now, half of those are already living in cities, and we expect more and more population to move into the cities or already grow into the cities. So by 2050, it will be probably at 75 to 80% of the population of the world will be living in cities. So this is the greatest challenge of humanity today. How are we going to cope with that, and how can we improve the conditions, and how can we better design with the 90% certainly of the population today. So if we really want to impact living conditions of the poor, we need to improve the conditions of neighborhoods, of towns, and of cities, which is where they are going to live or where they already live in the present time. But what are the main challenges from these 33 years that I'm talking about? I think that at the beginning, and 33 years ago, we were all denying the fact that everybody was moving to the cities and everything was happening in the cities. And we were very, very concerned about trying to keep people in the rural areas and creating policies for the rural areas. And finally, now we accept this fact, and we have to deal with this fact, and we have to work with this fact. The other thing is, precisely because of that, we still know, especially today, I know that because of that, as part of that response, we have megacities, corridors, you name it, metropolitan areas, medium-sized cities. I mean, we have a whole spectrum of things, but we're very concerned right now about medium-sized cities because are the fast-growing cities of the world today are happening in that medium-sized cities, and they're creating either suburbias or sprawling poor shanty towns or slums, just as we are calling them today. And the other thing that has changed completely, and Niemeyer will not deny it, when he created Brasilia and Chandigarh and all these places that were created, was we didn't knew by that oil prices and energy was going to be scarce and extremely, extremely pricey. So all these three things really put us in a new perspective all of a sudden. That's one big thing and big changes. The other important thing is now we have learned, and that's a good news, that urbanization, it's a good thing. Because now we have measured it and we have realized that when urbanization is properly managed, it brings economic growth, it brings social harmony, and it brings progress in every sense, politically, scientifically, technically. So it's good. In a way, urbanization is a good thing, and we have to make it work well. But we have learned as well that when it's poorly managed, urbanization creates social exclusion, creates poverty, creates urban sprawl, precisely, even pollution, contaminates more, and it also encourages unsustainable use of land, because it just expands without limit, creates precisely unsustainable use of the water, and in general, of natural resources. So it becomes extremely unbalanced when it's not precisely well managed. So what do we get from these ideas, and why do we have to then think about sustainable and inclusive cities today? Because now we know that cities have to have this balance between the economic, the social, the political, and the cultural issues. And these four pillars somehow are precisely what we are calling today the basis of a sustainable city and the basis of sustainable development that usually is going to happen or is already happening in cities. And that's why it's so important today to start analyzing and actually revise what are the far-reaching consequences of this whole urban dynamics. How do we get it right to do urbanization in the proper way with local authorities, with this 90% that we're talking today, and how do we balance precisely that this urbanization is well managed and it's well balanced with all these elements that we're talking today. So we need to understand the dynamics and the linkages that create what we might call today an inclusive city. An inclusive city because we're talking more and more, not so much of the poor only, but we have to acknowledge as well that in the cities is where we see as well what we call the urban divide. The urban divide, when you always see, regardless of if the city is very, very rich, you always see pockets of poverty. Or when a city is very poor, you see a sea of poverty and a few pockets of good urbanization going on, or even urbanization already gated today with lots of dogs and guards and IDs and all these security things that we see today. So it is important to understand that it's not only the idea of creating cities that are more just, that are more balanced in terms of that divide between the rich and the poor. But we need to start thinking as well in innovative ways of creating cities that will have these 4 pillars, the economic, the social, the political, and the cultural, and how they relate to each other. So taking 1 more minute, 2 more minutes, we have to start thinking that economic inclusion is tied closely to the social and to the political dimension. Or thinking that reform of governance institutions, which are very important for the pillar precisely of the political and the social streams, has to be combined with modern public policies and has to have novel ideas of how today the social spectrum can participate at all levels. And these are crucially important economic, there are very important issues if we want to address the economic issue and really bring the economic growth all together. We have to think as well that institutions, health institutions, schools, good education, are the ones that are going to bring the major asset to a city. So we cannot only talk about economic growth if we don't bring together all the assets that actually bring what we call the assets of population, of healthy and educated population. So knowledge is a prerequisite to enhance, on the one hand, civic participation, but social and political and cultural spheres are very important if we really want to think how to improve the economic sustainability of the city. So it's all linked. So where cities fail to move institutions and procedures that are more responsive to the needs of ordinary people, talking about the 90%, including the poor, exclusion and social inequality will continue to interfere with effective basic rights and liberties for everyone. So it links at the end, and that's why it's so linked, this idea of thinking of sustainable, inclusive cities, if we want to talk about the right to the city. Because if not, we will be talking about the right to the city in just legal terms of saying, yes, we have added in the Constitution or in our laws, but at the end of the day, if we don't do the pillars and we don't do an inclusive city, it will be very difficult to find this right to the city in the clear and obvious sense. How am I doing on time? I can just carry on for many hours, not many minutes, so I don't know. Maybe I should leave it here just to set the ground and carry on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Martinez. I see a number of our NGO friends here, Diane Davis and Cheryl Kazan and others, and I think all of you would know or be happy to know that apart from being an international civil servant and an academic, Ms. Martinez was also an NGO, founded an NGO in small community enterprises. Was that in Mexico or in Mexico? So she belongs to all of us in this room. And I think the connection that she drew between urbanization and economic sustainability for good or for bad clarifies at least one question I had, which is why a distinguished urban planner like Dr. Michael Cohen should be writing a book about the recovery of the Argentinian economy after the crisis of 2001. So obviously there's a connection there somewhere. Now, Dr. Cohen, as I mentioned, is with the New School. Before that, he was with NYU, another member of the UN Academic Impact. And one of his books was titled Making Cities Fit for People. And I think that's really, in a sense, resonant of what our exhibit and this discussion is about. So, Dr. Cohen?
Thank you very much. I'd like to just start by congratulating Cooper-Hewitt and Cynthia for this exhibition, which I think is an important contribution in the city. And I think it also helps to push the conversation along in the city and in a broader sense about the importance of design. I want to start off with a brief UN story. In the 1980s, the UN decided, actually 1978, that the 1980s would be the International Drinking Water and Sanitation Decade. And during that period, 550 million people received drinking water who didn't have it at the beginning of the decade. This seemed like an extraordinary accomplishment. Everyone could say, amazing, 550 million people. Yet at the end of the decade, more people did not have water than at the beginning of the decade because of population growth. So it seems to me that story suggests that we really need to adopt a very dynamic frame in thinking about the housing problem and thinking about the urban problem and all these big numbers that we hear all the time. The world is changing at a very rapid rate, and doing more of the same is not enough. That is, we have to think about doing things in a different way, and here's where I think I will later make the link to design. The comment was made, Ramu started off by mentioning the right to the city and Lefebvre. An anthropologist, an Indian anthropologist, Arjuna Padarai, added to the right of the city, the right to the city, he argued that there was a right to aspire, that everyone has the right to aspire to a future, to think about improving life over time. And I would argue, in the context of this conversation, that if we think about design as intentionality, about acting on the world, that actually we ought to be talking about the right to design as well. And let me develop that a little bit more. If you look at the record of the international community in working on cities over the last maybe 2 generations, by the year 2000, there were projects financed by the World Bank, the bilaterals, and the regional development banks in 11,000 cities and towns are in the developing world. 11,000 cities and towns. That's a big number. And yet, when you think about that and you think about the number of people involved and whether these projects actually made a difference, you have to be really quite humble about that, because in fact, when you look at a country like India or a country like Brazil or even smaller countries, these projects really did not have a significant impact on most of the world. And so the notion here is that the international community began to talk about influencing behavior through policy. That is, by municipal policy, by national policy, that somehow policy would encourage the market, encourage people to do the right thing in constructing cities. Well, what we've learned in the last 20 years, I would argue, is that policy itself has a lot of flaws. It has a lot of limitations. Very frequently, governments are not stable and aren't able to really ensure the continuity of policy, nor do we know that policy is oriented towards the poor. Policy frequently is the bulldozer, removing the poor. And so part of the challenge here is to ask the question whether design, that is, understanding design as the behaviors of individuals and groups in solving problems, whether in fact design is on the way to replacing policy as the major factor in determining the physical and social solutions that we're going to see in the cities. It's a hypothesis. And I come to that question and that hypothesis from some work that I've been learning from in my own university at the New School, and some of my colleagues are here from the New School, where there's a big debate going on about the relationship between the social sciences and design. The social sciences presume to be able to explain context to us. How do we understand behavior, how people live, why they live that way? What are the physical and economic and social characteristics of context? And then design is somehow acting on that context. But the link between design and social science, between design and context, is less clear. And I would argue that, in a sense, the exhibition that we see upstairs is a step in educating us and provoking us to think more about those linkages. That is, how does design actually play such an important role? If we believe these numbers, these 1 billion or 2 billion or take another billion, 3 billion people coming over this next period, do we really believe that government policy is going to solve those problems? I, for one, don't. I think that there won't be governmental public resources to deal with those things, nor public will or political will. And in any case, most political will is not pro-poor anyway. So, in fact, I think the issue here is whether design itself can be supported and understood as a process which really needs to grow and develop in a much more elaborate context. And so I would just end my remarks by saying that somehow we have to, I would argue, celebrate this nexus between local knowledge of context, with intentionality to find solutions which have positive environmental impacts and not negative, that are energy intensive, that are not energy intensive, that are indeed inclusive, and that we think through these processes a lot more. But it seems to me that we're at a moment where the paradigm has to change. It's not just Occupy Wall Street and some of the terrible things that are going on downtown today, all right, in terms of the repression of Wall Street, of the movement. But we really need to think about new ways to understand how people can work together in small units, in larger units, to get the information from context in order to come up with better solutions for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cohen. Those two fascinating concepts which you linked so integrally, the right to design and policy as a bulldozer, I think that's something which really comes home in a situation where a population or a community finds itself dispossessed not because of its own actions or inactions, but because of circumstances beyond its control. And certainly one of the most compelling such circumstances is environmental degradation. So what do communities in an environmentally degraded area do to be able to rehabilitate themselves and their livelihoods and their homes? They may have an option of policy which is imposed upon them from above, or an option of design which they can work with. And I think what Sherina Odbert discovered was that design offers a much more effective solution than distant policy. So please.
Oh, geez. I'm losing my voice, so please bear with me. First, I'd like to thank Cynthia and Sarah and UN Academic Impact for inviting me here this evening. Kounkey Design Initiative is a nonprofit design practice that works with communities to implement scalable design interventions that improve life in the informal city. Next. Oh, thank you. Thanks. We launched the initiative as a way to address poor living conditions caused by urbanization that traditional design firms were reluctant to confront. We started with the assumption that slums were not going away, but that a better standard of living for residents based on incremental, practical interventions and improvements could be easily achieved. So in 2006, we launched, next please, in 2006 we launched the Kibera Public Space Project. It's a network of public spaces that sustainably transforms communities in the large slum of Kibera, which is in Nairobi. Residents there have taught us that housing alone is not enough, and that true upgrading requires not only new...
Comment, please.
Okay, let me try to group some of the comments. There was a statement about housing being the most important problem, and I would like to argue against that. And actually, I would like to associate with myself with one of the comments made in the back about the importance of jobs. I think that, and I'm very interested in that sense in Chelina's presentation about using public space for productive purposes. In kind of crude terms, I would say that the international community entered the city through the house and the bathroom, by which I mean it focused on housing and residential infrastructure. And we've ended up with slogans like cities without slums, as if this is a realistic objective. And if one thinks about slums in relative terms, I would argue we're always going to have slums. Some housing will be better than others. But what we really need is we need to have cities with jobs, because if people don't have employment, there's no way that they can afford decent housing or anything else. They can't feed themselves. And what's really noteworthy, I think, in a lot of the international discussion about cities is that the employment question is largely off the table. And that's really, I think, an enormous mistake. So one point I would argue here simply is that when we think about housing and we think about intervention, we have to link this to the question of productivity and employment and jobs and income for people. What was most interesting to me about the exhibition here is that rarely are there examples just about housing. There's housing with something else. That's what makes them more interesting. And when we think about sort of the mythologies or the stories we hear, the narratives we hear about a place like Curitiba, we hear always that you don't solve one problem at a time. You have to solve more than one problem with the same action. And so I think the employment issue is a really big one. There was a comment made, I think the first comment reflected on, made mention of the multidisciplinarity of this. In my own experience, in the 60s, we thought that the architects and the planners were the people who could speak to the urban question. And they led us to housing and infrastructure. But then we discovered that they weren't dealing enough with institutions. And so we needed people to talk about institutions, about civil society, about gender, about community base, and that wasn't in the narrative of the architects and the planners. And now we understand that the city is really determining the future of countries, because if the city is not productive, the countries can't grow and can't have income. So now we need the economists, God forbid. All right. But I think the point is that we need to think in a broader sense of the range of disciplines and how they come together. And I think that part of the challenge of design sort of going forward is how a lot of these disciplines can be combined. I think one of the last questions about climate change and resiliency is a particularly good example of that. Because we really don't know, I mean, we're beginning to have experiences around the world of the impact of climate change, but we can expect it to be very heavy and very serious, with implications in the social, in the economic, in the political, and in many, many dimensions. And so we need much more of a conversation going on across the disciplines. Finally, there was a question about corporate sponsorship and the role of sort of the private sector in this. Somewhere along the line, maybe it was in the 70s, or maybe Cecilia and I are the ones here who know about this stuff, but somewhere along the line there was a confusion that housing actually was provided by the public sector. That's just not true. There's no country besides China where more than 15% of the housing has come from the public sector. Public sector housing mostly comes out of the non-public sector, from communities, from businesses, from individual households. And so this question of the corporate involvement and participation in things has to be involved. You can't legislate against the economy, against the private sector and those kind of actors. So I think we've really got our hands full, and it's a big challenge. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Cohen. Ms. Martinez?
Thank you. I think somebody asked about what I mentioned about urbanization is good. I mean, urbanization is good because we have seen through the studies that in general, when there is good urbanization, there is a tendency for economic growth. So yes, it is good. Now, that doesn't mean, and I'm glad you're asking me, because it doesn't mean that you have to address the needs of the poor. You have to address the needs of everyone in a town or in a city. If a city works well, it works well for everybody. The problem, and that's what I mentioned, is that today we find, and precisely in the studies that were presented here today, it's a wonderful opportunity to analyze them. They were part of what? Of what the town or the town mayors didn't do. So what we learned, and those lessons we learned them through the 60s and 70s, was the population arrived into cities, migrated from the countryside to the city, looking for jobs, absolutely, didn't find the jobs, but they stay in the city. So what we learned in the 70s, which was very much the process of saying industrialization will start developing urbanization because there were the jobs, and then people we develop the city together, didn't happen. So yes, we started on, we call it through the backyard. So what we all of a sudden started to develop were shanty towns, which were very much dormitories, and what people were expecting to find, which was accommodation and a job, didn't happen. It was only accommodation, period. So the whole economy went completely the other way around, and that's where we started developing as well informal economies. So everything was informal altogether. So the big challenge today is how do we make cities work? And I think those are the wonderful examples that we saw today in Nairobi and in Sao Paulo, which is, again, people are doing for themselves what local authorities are not doing for them. So once they found some kind of shelter, yes, it is very important to start designing the cities, especially the public realm, to make them work. And it's only by opening spaces, starting from streets, which sometimes they don't even exist. Once you start doing that, yes, you can start creating other productive projects, because it's usually what comes together hand in hand and very much in the same way. People look for shelter and look for jobs. Now, the way they solve these problems as well is because they have a social structure that depend on being able to perform the whole thing. And that's why we keep insisting that you have to have all these elements together. You have to have certain social cohesion and working sometimes with private sector, public sector, universities, you name it, whoever it can be around. You have to have certain kind of governance. You have to have, yes, economy behind, jobs, creation of jobs, and yes, you have to have some form of shelter, but shelter not alone, but in the design of the city. So I completely agree with Michael in the sense that it's back to design, but the public realm, and let the rest of the people do what they have to do. So in a way, what we have to sustain today is not only creating architects or even economists, God forbid, as you said, sociologists, you name it, whatever, it's an interdisciplinary measure. But at the end of the day, what we really have to build today for the young population is to become real citizens, responsible people that will understand their rights, but that will fulfill their responsibilities as well. And that is what the whole issue is about. And that's the whole idea of the impact of academic impact, is that young generations today will fulfill their task of being responsible citizens. And I think that will be a good starting point.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Ms. Albert?
I'll just answer a couple of questions due to my voice. I'll start maybe with the question directed toward our work in Nairobi. And you asked, what is the process for identifying the income-generating activities? Our work is very community-driven and participatory, not just from sort of the beginning information-gathering part of the process, but on through construction and eventual management of the enterprises that we create. So we really start with the community and their existing ideas, talents, business activities, and what we bring to that is maybe a different way of analyzing the current economic activities or the current possibilities for economic activity, and then together with the community we kind of make decisions about what might be most appropriate in that area. So just to give you one quick example, at our first site, there was a talent of weaving in the community, but it was from people's rural area, and no one was really doing it anymore because I guess the inputs weren't there. But then we realized that there was this dam next to the site that was covered with this plant called water hyacinth. And then we started to do research on what you could do with water hyacinth. And at that point, we realized that it could be made into soap, it could be weaved into baskets, things like that. And so that became a perfect opportunity to create a new income-generating activity based on an existing resource, an unused resource, and an existing talent and interest of the community. So that's why the income-generating activities vary from project to project, because it's really based on existing context. And maybe that would lead to the other question that I'd like to comment on, was the jobs, how jobs kind of influence physical development, and if there's a relationship. And again, I would maybe point to our work and say that in a very practical sense, the projects that we develop with communities do lead to more physical development and improvement of the community. So the small enterprises that operate at a site generate profit, and that profit is distributed depending on the enterprise, to the community group or to an individual. And the community group, in many cases, takes that profit and reinvests it into the community. So again, one quick example from our first project, we helped the community launch 3 income-generating activities at the first site. Now at that, from some of the profit from those first 3, the community created, paid to have a direct line to the city water line so that they could have continuous water supply that they could sell to residents in addition to the rainwater, which of course contributed to the physical development of that community. And then from there, they began to launch other income-generating activities off of that, namely a laundry business, because they now had a consistent supply of water. So that site now has 7 income-generating activities, some that are more robust and profitable than others, but both the site has physically developed, the community has physically developed, as has the income-generating capacity of the residents in the community. So I would say that jobs and physical development can and should be very closely linked. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Mr. Souza?
Well, firstly, we're responding for the answer about climate change in Brazil. And I can assume that this year we received the C40 climate change group in São Paulo, and we assume that the compromise to work on this. And the law, the federal law of the climate change has been assigned for the federal and state and municipality of São Paulo. And especially in São Paulo, we are worried about the flooding problem because we have the raining. Now we're going to start in January until March. We have the heavy rains. And I also joined the climate change with the designing, because the city of São Paulo were designed since the early and the sprawling growth. It's near the rivers, because for the mobility at the time, the trains were crossing the rivers, and then the roads and all the city growth on that place, and the width of the river that must be respected at the time, they were not respected. So you have the growth of roads and cities, and you have now the problem of floods. But you have the calculation of the canalization of the rivers. But with the climate change, it also grows the rain. So the rain is getting more higher and longer times, and we are having this problem of flooding. So now the challenge for the municipality of São Paulo is to solve this huge problem, talking about São Paulo. And talking about the north of Brazil, we have the problem of dry weather, that we have problem of the forests. We don't have the forests and the grains. The people don't have food because of the dry weather. So this is the main focus of the federal government and the 3 spheres of governance. But I hope I answered your questions. And a little bit general discussion that just to end it. I totally agree with Mr. Cohen and Ms. Martinez when they are talking about designing a cooperative job, about multidisciplinary tasks and employment in public spaces. I didn't have a chance to show the whole project that we are doing, but the master plans are the main focus nowadays in São Paulo, because we have to design the public space, open areas, jobs and capacity courses for people that live in there, so they can be able to maintenance of their own and to step forward. And the gentrification, as the girl was saying, when we design the city, we can extinguish the problem of favela, not extinguish the favela, because the favelas cannot be, some favelas cannot be extinguished because of the consolidation, because of the integration and connection with the city. But we can extinguish the problem of sanitation, because housing is not just housing, as I totally agree. They're not just housing. You have to integrate forces with mobility, compact city, because it's so dense, so you have to design in maybe we will densify and open spaces. So when you do that in designing, joint with politics, that you must have the will of working together and to step forward, because we have the changes of the administrations. So how to maintain this administration going and continue, and the continuance of good jobs. That's why we established the law that now the municipal housing plan is undergoing the law, so then they're going to have to obey this criteria. So there's a way that we can minimize this setbacks and not doing what's happening. Well, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Souza. Dr. Mahmoud, Eden, please.
Thank you very much. I would like also to start with this multidisciplinarity, because I fully agree with the view of Mrs. Martinez, this holistic view in which we have to take care of all aspects whenever we are talking about housing. But I remember one day one of my students put me the following question. He said, if we look to different bugs, to different insects, to their nests, these nests are looking so perfect from the point of view of, let's say, minimal material, of organizing, of flows and everything. And if we look, let's say, to the housing in the sense of human beings, then we see many other, let's say, differences and many other disparities among these principles. Why is that difference? Usually we tend to say that in the case of human beings, we have the conscience, we have rational, we have theories and so on. Why we are not able to cope with these principles which are that natural? So in that perspective, I am an engineer, and as an engineer we always say that there is a coupling between the process and the structure. So whenever we are talking about housing, we have to take into consideration the process, the people there, the social groups, the economics around and everything related to that. But of course, in the case of human beings, in the case of these societies, unfortunately the way of education and the way of behavior up to now was very far of these sustainability aspects. So the slide towards opulence, the tendency to, let's say, of greed and this kind of behaviors generated many disparities in the society. So in that perspective, I think that persuading on the principles of sustainable development, probably we could come closer to what is natural to be. I would like to recommend all of you a very nice book which is signed by Adrian Bejan from Duke University, The Constructal Theory. And in the constructal theory, he has an approach of, that might be applied very well both in planning and also in architecture, in coping with the principles of nature in, let's say, developing, let's say, anthropogenic type of structures. this constructal theory is saying very, very simply, I mean, a structure should be developed in that way to ease the behavior of a specific process. So the whole, let's say, development of a different, let's say, of a specific area of a city, the streets and everything could follow this kind of principles which are connected to this. So coming back to the involvement of education and of universities, I do consider, and I'm sure that all of us, we agree with this, that education has a major role in that, but more than that, we do consider that it should be the role of students to be much more active and involved in this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eden. And at this point, I would like to thank all the distinguished panel here. And a very particular word of thanks to Cynthia Smith and the team from Cooper-Hewitt, and to Cooper-Hewitt itself for having co-sponsored this exhibit with us. And to all of you who've come from, many of you have come from schools and universities which are not exactly in our proximity. We're very grateful that you've come at this hour, and we look forward to your participation in more programs associated with this exhibit in particular, and with the United Nations academic impact in general. Thank you very much, and good night.